Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Dave Cook from the Monitor. Our guest today is Douglas Elmendorf, Director of the Congressional Budget Office. This is his 5th visit with our group, though there's probably a trend there. Mr. Elmendorf became Director of the CBO in January of 2009 and brings an impressive background to the assignment. His undergraduate degree is from Princeton, Phi Beta Kappa. His master's and doctorate in economics are from Harvard. Before being named CBO Director, our guest taught at Harvard, was on the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors and the Federal Reserve Board, and served as Deputy Assistant Treasury Secretary for Economic Policy. Just before his selection to head the CBO, he was Senior Fellow in the Economic Studies program at Brookings. Thus endeth the biographical portion of our program. Now on to the ritual recitation of mechanical details. As always, we're on the record here. Please, no live blogging or tweeting or other means of filing while the breakfast is underway. There's no embargo when the session ends, except that our friends at C-SPAN have agreed not to air video of this session until 1 hour after the breakfast is over to give reporters in the room a chance to file. Finally, if you'd like to ask a question, please do the traditional thing and send me a subtle, non-threatening signal, and I'll happily call on one and all. We'll start off by offering our guests the opportunity to make some opening comments. Then we'll move to questions from around the table. Thanks again for doing this, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to come back. I wanted to start with just a few minutes on some pictures taken from our recent report on the slow recovery of the labor market. We released this together with our outlook for the budget and economy a few weeks ago. The developments in the labor market during the past several years have been among the most puzzling aspects of the economic recovery, and for millions of Americans, among the most distressing aspects of the economic recovery. And we took a particularly careful look at labor market developments as part of this year's updating of our economic and budget projections. In our view, the slow recovery of the labor market stems primarily from slow growth in the demand for goods and services, and to a smaller extent from various structural factors. Our analysis shows that considerable slack remains in the labor market. We estimate that the economy is about 6 million jobs short of where it would be if the unemployment rate was back down to its pre-recession level and the labor force participation rate was back up to the level it would be without the current cyclical weakness. Looking ahead, under current federal laws regarding taxes and spending, we expect that the unemployment rate will decline to 5.8% by the end of 2017 and to 5.5% by 2024, reflecting both a strengthening economy and strengthening demand for workers, but also the waning of some of these structural factors that are pushing up the unemployment rate today. We think the labor force participation rate, shown in the middle panel, will move down despite some upward pressure from the strengthening labor market and from drawing some workers back into the labor force. There will be continued downward pressure on the participation rate from demographic changes, particularly the retirement of the baby boom generation. So on balance, we think the participation rate will decline for the coming decade. The share of the population that will be employed, shown in the bottom panel, is subject to these same cross currents. There'll be some cyclical pressure upward on that rate as the economy strengthens and firms feel the need to hire more workers, but there'll be ongoing downward pressure from demographic factors and from some aspects of fiscal policy. On balance, we think the employment to population ratio will rise a little bit over the next few years, but then decline further after that. And I hope that after some of the attention to other aspects of our recent work has subsided a little, that you'll have a chance to go back and take a look at this report, but I think it covers very important issues for the U.S. economy. I will stop there and try to answer your questions.
Thanks for doing that. In a profile of you in Washingtonian, one of your predecessors, Robert Reischauer, was quoted as saying, quote, "If the folks who invited you to the dance want to drive you home at the end of it, you haven't done your job." And based on the reaction to the CBO studies on the labor market effects of the Affordable Care Act and yesterday's report on the impact of the minimum wage increase, you seem to be doing your job. Yesterday on a phone call with reporters, Betsy Stevenson of the Council of Economic Advisors said that CBO is, quote, "not fully appreciating how much the literature has moved," unquote, on spillover effects of raising the minimum wage. What made you and your team take the approach you did, estimating a loss of about 500,000 jobs and benefiting about 16.5 million workers, when, according to the CEA, the bulk of economic studies have concluded that the effects on employment of minimum wage increases in the range now under consideration are likely to be, quote, small to non-existent.
I don't want to respond directly to what the CEA has said. We try to talk about our analysis, let other people talk about theirs. But I want to be clear that our analysis of the effects of an increase in the minimum wage is completely consistent with the latest thinking in the economics profession. We did an exhaustive review of the literature in this area up through reports that were released last month. There are a very large number of studies, as you know. They reach a range of conclusions, and the studies all have strengths and weaknesses. And in the long methodological appendix to our report, we talk about some of the characteristics of studies that made them more or less compelling in our view. But a balanced reading of the set of research studies in this area led us to conclude that an increase in the minimum wage would probably have a small negative effect on employment, but there was substantial uncertainty around that estimate as we reported. Naturally, some economists focus more on studies that show smaller employment effects. Other economists focus on studies that show larger employment effects. Our responsibility for the Congress is to report the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes and, where possible, the range of likely outcomes. That's what we've done in this report. If you try to compare our analysis to what other economists have said, it's a little hard because most other economists don't have to put numbers behind the words of their evaluations. But we have looked at some of these other statements by economists. One place one might look is a survey conducted by economists at the University of Chicago. They ask a panel of leading economists from across the country questions about economic policy on a regular basis. And when they asked that panel about the effects of raising the minimum wage to $9 an hour a year ago, about half of the economists who had some answer to that question said that that increase to $9 would make it, quote, noticeably harder, unquote, for low-skilled workers to find employment. And about the other half of the economists responding to that survey said that it would not make it noticeably harder for low-wage workers to find employment. In our analysis of the effects of raising the minimum wage to $9, we give a range from a reduction in employment of 2.5% to a slight increase in employment. We don't know exactly what the respondents to that survey meant by noticeably harder, but if noticeably harder means a 2.5% reduction in employment, then our range of minus 2.5% to a slight increase seems to us to map quite nicely into half of those economists thinking it would be noticeably harder and half thinking it would not be. Another place one might look is to the letter signed by several hundred economists advocating an increase in the minimum wage. Of course, that is not a random sample of economists. That is a set of economists who support raising the minimum wage. And they are presumably disproportionately those who think that the effects on employment would be smaller. But nonetheless, I'm not sure we would disagree with their statement of the evidence. What they said is that, let's see if I can find my copy of it. What they said is that there would be, quote, increases in the minimum wage have had little or no negative effect on the employment of minimum wage workers, unquote. Well, again, they don't say what they mean by little in that statement. The increase in the minimum wage that we looked at that is most analogous to the past increases studied in the research literature is this $9 increase. So we estimate a range from a 2.5% reduction to a slight increase. Again, without knowing exactly what little means in this context, the range we have looks to me like a little reduction to essentially no change. Now, the last thing I'll say on this is that we also looked, as you know, at the effect of raising the minimum wage to $10.10, in addition to looking at the effects of raising the minimum wage to $9. And we estimate that raising the minimum wage to $10.10 would have a much larger effect on employment, but still, I think, a small effect, but larger than the effect of raising the minimum wage to $9. And that difference is for good reasons. The first point to recognize is that raising the minimum wage to $10.10 would just affect a lot more people than raising the minimum wage to $9. So we estimate the number of people whose wages would go up would be much larger for the $10.10 raise than the $9 raise, 16.5 million as opposed to 7.5 million. So there's many more people who are affected. But also we think that there will be a larger percentage reduction in employment for that larger pool. And we offer a number of reasons in the report for expecting that effect to be somewhat larger. Let me just highlight two of them. One is that this increase to $10.10 that we talk about, modeled after some legislation being considered by the Congress, would be indexed for inflation at that point. So that's rather different from the past experience with the federal minimum wage and with many of the raises at state levels, where wages have been raised in nominal terms and then fixed at nominal minimum wage, fixed at a higher nominal level, that's then eroded in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms over time. This $10.10 increase we modeled would be adjusted for inflation. So it would just be higher not only to start with, but higher on an ongoing basis. And we think that will induce larger responses by firms. But secondly, this increase to $10.10 cuts much more deeply into the distribution of wages than an increase to $9. And you can see this on the cover of the report. The increase to $9 puts the minimum wage, would put the minimum wage back up near the 10th percentile of workers' wages. An increase to $10.10 puts the minimum wage much higher than that, higher relative to the distribution of wages than has been at any point in at least the 40 years that we cover here. And by cutting further into the wage distribution, both because it's a large increase and because it's starting from minimum wage, the level it's at, cutting so far into the distribution means that employers will face a larger shock in their costs and have more incentive to incur the adjustment costs that would be needed to make larger changes in their workforces. So we think there are very good economic reasons, and others, as I say in the report, for why the $10.10 indexed increase would have a bigger effect on employment than the increase at $9. And the $9 increase that we analyzed, which is the increase that's most comparable to what most economists have analyzed in the past, we think our estimates are completely consistent with the balance of the evidence.
Let me ask one last one myself, then we'll go to Damian Paletta, Paul Krausek, Brian Butler, and Steve Dina to start. You've got about a year left in your term, a little less. Do you feel that you are the CBO director who's worked in the most extreme political conditions? And if so, has it changed the reaction either to this or the reaction to the Affordable Care Act study or any others? Has it changed how you and your colleagues do your work?
When I became director, I was taken out to lunch by my predecessors as a group. And they all told stories of their experiences. And it was the sort of lunch where afterward you kind of wondered whether I'd done the right thing by signing up for the gig. So I think my predecessors all have stories to tell, and I cannot compare my experience to them. But I will say that we work quite hard and very carefully on all sorts of issues that don't see a lot of public attention. And we work very hard and carefully on issues that do receive public attention. And our method of working really doesn't differ. We're focused on trying to find the best possible estimate so that Congress has the best information to work with. And we do that across the board in all sorts of estimates that matter a lot to one committee or a small set of people, and estimates that matter a lot to a large crowd. And we don't take them any differently based on the attention they get, and we don't do anything differently if we think there will be more or less adverse reaction from different people. That's just not what we do.
Damian?
Okay, two-part question. I mean, obviously you were at Brookings and you worked in the Clinton Treasury Department. I think a lot of Democrats figured that you would sort of give them the benefit of the doubt on issues like minimum wage. How did you see keeping politics out of your analysis? And the second question is, what are you guys working on next that we should be ready for?
On the first question, my personal views about economic policy are completely irrelevant to the work that we do. And the personal views of my colleagues' economic policy are completely irrelevant to the work that we do. Congress does not care what we would do personally about policy, and they should not care about that. They've hired us to do objective analysis, and that's what we do. And that's what hundreds, maybe thousands of people have done at CBO for 39 years. And that's what a string of directors has done at CBO for 39 years. On the second question, we're working on lots of things. I don't have any any particular scoops to give you.
Feel free to blurt something out if it comes to you. Paul?
So in your budget and economic outlook, you estimated that as a result of the Affordable Care Act, there would be a reduced demand for jobs to the tune of about 2.5 million by the end of 10 years. And then in this minimum wage report, you're talking about a reduced demand by employers if the minimum wage is raised. Is there any kind of interaction or overlap between, on the one hand, people demanding less work, and on the other hand, employers having less demand for workers if the wage goes up?
Our analysis of the Affordable Care Act's effects on the labor market under current law and our analysis of the prospective effects of a minimum wage increase in the labor market are more or less independent. Labor market is affected by lots of forces all the time, and federal policy is only one, usually fairly small piece of what's happening. So for the Affordable Care Act, we estimate that there would be a reduction in the supply of labor because the Affordable Care Act reduces the incentive to work by a little bit through a variety of channels. I think you should think of that as a more or less separate question from what the effects of a minimum wage increase would be. As you note, the minimum wage increase is really affecting employers' demand for workers. But they're different sorts of effects. If this minimum wage increase were of one of the sorts we estimated or some other sort were passed into law, then our future projections of the economy would take on board that, as well as taking on board the Affordable Care Act, as well as other features of the tax code, as well as what else is going on in the economy. But there's no particular interaction between them.
Brian? Where are you?
On those same two issues, the labor supply effect from the Affordable Care Act and the demand effect from the minimum wage, are those first order effect, like for the Affordable Care Act piece of it, does that take into account what happens after the 2.5 million FTEs leave and more people want those jobs, and so that has an effect on wages and hiring? And sort of separately with the minimum wage, you forecast a range of employment effects, but you also say that a lot of people will have higher wages. Is there a multiplier that you factor into to have like a second order effect of what happens in the job market as a result of both of those two things independently?
So in our analysis of the Affordable Care Act, we focused on the effects on labor markets in the second half of the coming decade, by which point we expect the labor market will be back closer to its traditional balance between the supply of workers and the demand for workers. We talk a bit in that appendix about what would happen between now and then, but the quantification we offered was for the second half of the decade. So that's a point at which we think most people who are looking for work will be able to find work. So the people who withdraw from the labor force at that point would not be, or work fewer hours while still working, would not be replaced by other people who would be stepping up. In our analysis of the effects of raising the minimum wage, we have focused on the period, the end of 2016, because that's the point at which both minimum wage increases will be largely phased in, or would be fully phased in. And our estimate of the employment effects, the estimates do incorporate the effects of the redistribution of income down the income scale toward people who are more likely to spend that money, and thus the boost in demand for goods and services and the boost in employment that would come from that. And our quantitative estimates are the netting out of that effect with the other effects that we talked about.
They're both basically equilibrium effects. The 2.5 million and the small increase to 1 million jobs lost they both incorporate second order.
They're equilibriums of a sort, yes.
Stephen, back in the cheap seats.
I want to ask you about the process and rules that CBO follows. It seems like over the last 10 years, and these are my words, it seems like members of Congress have figured out ways to game the 10-year budget window. And we've seen, doc fix payments, 10 years worth of pay fors pushed into 1 year's worth of spending, which we, presume, which is a structural thing that will have to come back again and again and again. I'm wondering if you have any, constructive criticism or recommendations for members of Congress, either about process or just sort of about how to approach CBO with this. I guess second of all, if there's I don't know if you guys do when you do your scores, like, so for example, if you borrow over 10 years to pay for, if you spend now and then you end up paying for it over 10 years, presumably, especially with our current deficits, there's a debt cost that builds up. I actually don't know whether you guys include that 10-year debt cost, in the early years for the debt service cost in your cost estimates. But do you do that? Can you do that? Should you do that?
We don't incorporate debt service in our normal cost estimates. We just offer year by year for 10-year estimate of the costs, and we provide a straight summation of those numbers over the 10 years. I think members of Congress understand that policies that widen deficits also incur additional debt service, and policies that narrow deficits have the other effect. But it's hard to know how a particular policy will affect debt service. We know how the government is financing its existing debt. We can make projections of what will happen overall. But to understand just how any increment to debt would be financed is actually a sort of subtle question. And I don't think that our not including that extra, whatever it would be, 10, 15, 20% charge, if you will, would really affect the fiscal policy decisions. I think it is understood across the Congress that there are debt service implications.
But you guys end up showing something in balance when in a 10-year look back, it wouldn't necessarily be in balance if you'd included the debt service cost from, if in a situation like I talked about where you had an immediate deficit increase in the first year paid for either in the last 3 years or over 10 years, correct?
I think one of my predecessors, Rudy Penner, said a number of years ago in a different context, the process isn't the problem is the problem. So I'd like to use that line here. I think that there are, where we think that there are important differences in the effects of policies beyond the 10-year window, then we try to look out beyond the 10-year window. And in our analysis of healthcare reform legislation, and our analysis of immigration legislation, and our analysis of some of the climate legislation that was discussed a number of years ago, and in a few other cases, we look out beyond the 10-year window because those are situations where we think the policies being contemplated would have markedly different effects that we should bring to the attention of the Congress. And in those cases, the Congress is particularly interested in our trying to look beyond the 10-year window. But I don't think in general that the cutting off at 10 years changes much from if we cut off at 15 or 20 or did any other thing in particular.
With what you mentioned, immigration, and you guys did essentially a sort of dynamic scoring on immigration, figuring out how the labor would affect. Do you expect that within 10 years CBO will be doing dynamic scoring more broadly for taxes, for spending?
No, I do not. We did 500 formal cost estimates last year. We did maybe 10 times as many informal estimates as committees were developing proposals. And for 99% or so of those proposals we examined, there would be no noticeable macroeconomic effects. And the time that we required to do macroeconomic estimates would be immense and would basically paralyze the workings of the Congress on so many issues. I want to draw a real distinction between that set of estimates, that's most of our work, and the work we do on a few pieces of legislation that would have significant macroeconomic effects. So immigration is a case where the goal of the legislation in the minds of many people and the reason to be opposed to it in the minds of many other people is a significant change in the size of the U.S. labor force. CBO people felt a number of years ago when this came up that given that that was so integral to the legislation, that pretending there would be no change in the labor force, which is that would be our standard assumption, would just be so much at variance with the issues that Congress was confronting that we needed to reach beyond our normal approach. So CBO did a number of years ago, and we did again last year, a separate analysis beyond the normal cost estimate that looked at some of those macroeconomic effects. And I've said on some occasions that if the Congress were to be contemplating an overhaul of the U.S. tax code that would have significant macroeconomic effects, that we would be happy to do analysis of those economic effects as well. But I think those situations are correctly viewed as rare exceptions, and exceptions in the cases where it really matters, where the Congress's objectives, where the issues at stake are around the size of the labor force or the size of the economy. And that's just not true for so much of what we do.
Brian? Oh, I'm sorry.
Actually, just to clarify, are you saying that if they did tax reform, you would do a dynamic scoring along the lines of what we saw with the immigration bill? Or would it be sort of
We would
an
do a
appendix?
separate analysis,
Okay.
if the Congress were interested, of the economic effects of tax reform. And CBO's done in the past some analyses of the economic effects of changes in tax policy. For example, we do an analysis almost every year of the economic effects of the president's budget. And to remind you how this works, we normally release an estimate of the president's proposals conditioned on our baseline economic projections, analogous to how we would do a cost estimate. And then we follow that up, maybe a month later, with an economic analysis of the president's proposals. And that economic analysis incorporates the effects of changes in budget deficits and also the effects of changes in incentives through changes in tax rules and other things. But those are separate pieces of work. And it's a good example of the case where the economic analysis takes basically a month after the basic budget analysis is finished. So what I've said, and I said this, I think, starting with the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, of which some members were considering tax reform, that if they put forward a tax reform proposal, that we would be happy to do an analysis of its economic effects. That would be separate from the basic estimates, but actually would come mostly from the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, probably. So these are separate pieces of work that we've offered, that we did for immigration, and that we've offered to do in the case of tax reform.
The official score of a tax reform bill would not have that dynamic scoring.
Official score would not have those effects in them.
Noam?
Two health care related questions. Noam Levy with the LA Times. One is, can you talk a little bit about what the experiences of states that had expanded coverage, how that informed your analysis of labor force participation in the most recent report? And then secondly, just very quickly, I think it's been a couple of years since you guys have done an analysis of changing the tax treatment of health insurance, and given the apparently renewed interest among some on the Hill in that particular subject, any plans to revisit that?
So on the first question, we've looked at what's happened in some states that have expanded health insurance coverage, but there aren't very many of them that have done something that's particularly analogous to the Affordable Care Act. So our estimates were based mostly on evidence from other circumstances. And I'll mention two sorts of evidence, pieces of evidence. One is the phasing out of subsidies in insurance exchanges as your income rises under the Affordable Care Act creates an implicit tax. And to estimate the effect of that, we use the very large literature on how changes in explicit tax rates have affected labor supply. And we did a review of that literature a year or two ago, wrote a set of 3 papers explaining how we read the literature and the estimates we drew from it. So we use that literature primarily to estimate the effects of the changes of the effects of the withdrawal of exchange subsidies. For the effects of the Medicaid expansion in the Affordable Care Act, we drew on literature that looked at states that had expanded or contracted Medicaid in the past. So that's some of the states that have done an Affordable Care Act type reform have done that, but there's also a much larger set of states that have made changes in Medicaid over time. So it's a much larger and more robust literature, and we drew on that. On your second question, actually one of the approaches to deficit reduction that we analyzed in our reports last fall were changes in the tax treatment of health insurance. So I'd refer you to our reports on that.
Quick follow-up on the states, if you don't mind. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, there was Massachusetts, obviously. There are a number of states that had more limited Medicaid expansions. How did that evidence jive or not jive with the tax analysis of subsidies in terms of measuring labor force participation? Does that make sense?
Well, I think that to estimate the effects of the Affordable Care Act on labor markets, we had to keep track of a lot of different channels. The principle that providing health insurance subsidies to low-income people would reduce the incentive to work. It was not something that is a novel idea on our part. We wrote about it in the summer of 2009 before there were any specific proposals to be estimated in terms of the basic factors. But to do the quantitative estimates, we have to follow a lot of different channels. So we drew on the best evidence we could for these different sorts of channels. And I think the effects of expansion we estimated separately from the effects of the changes in exchange subsidies. These two literatures that we drew on are basically distinct literatures, and we drew the lessons from each of them to apply to the aspect of the Affordable Care Act to which they were most closely linked.
Kathy?
Hi, Kathy Taylor with the Orange County Register. Could you update for me some statements you made 2011 hearing about the role of uncertainty in the marketplace and its effect on the economy? That would be that federal policy is diminishing household and business spending, and that uncertainty covers a whole set of policies, and then you name them. So what are those policies today? Have they changed a bit, and to what degree impact are they having? Is it waxing or waning from 2011?
We and a lot of other analysts think that uncertainty about federal policies has weighed on the recovery, but neither we nor other analysts, I think, have been successful at quantifying those effects. And I've spoken in the past about the uncertainty about fiscal policy and also uncertainty about regulatory policy in healthcare and the financial system and environmental and energy regulation. I think uncertainty about federal fiscal policy is a little smaller today than it was in 2011. The expiring tax cuts from 2001 and 2003 have been mostly extended and partly allowed to expire. So there's no cliff or deadline right around the corner for that. The uncertainty about appropriations seems to have been settled, at least at the overall level, for this fiscal year and for the next fiscal year. Not to say that Congress couldn't come back to that issue, but there is at least some explicit plan that has been agreed to. So we think that those developments have reduced the uncertainty about federal fiscal policy, but they've not eliminated it. Analysts can read in our studies and elsewhere the fact that the federal budget is on an unsustainable path. So clearly future adjustments of some sort will be needed to taxes or spending or both. But I think uncertainty is less than it was. But since I couldn't quantify it before, can't really quantify it now either.
On balance?
On balance, there's less uncertainty.
Less uncertainty.
Less uncertainty than there was, yes. And we think that's a positive factor for the economy.
David?
I think there was a lot of relief that the budget deal went for 2 years, or gave us 2 years of spending numbers versus 1 year. Just wondering, there are some proposals out there to go to a 2-year budgeting system. What are the pros and cons of those?
Well, I think it would be, as the manager of a very, very small part of the federal government, it would certainly be helpful for us to know what our funding will be sometime into the future. And presumably that effect is much, much more important for people running large and complicated parts of the federal government. So I think having a little, for the managers of government operations to have a little better sense of where their funding is going would be very useful. On the other hand, Congress takes advantage of the annual appropriations process to recalibrate where it thinks federal funds, taxpayers' funds, are best spent. And if one tries to put that on autopilot at the individual agency function level, then Congress loses that flexibility. It's not really for us to say how Congress should balance those considerations.
We've gone for 4 years or so without really going through the normal process, hopefully trying to get back to it.
Well, that I think makes another good point, though, which is that I think the question is not so much what the official process is. The question really is, how does the process actually work? And if we went officially to biennial budgeting, but in fact didn't decide till well into a fiscal year what the amounts of money would be, then having officially gone to 2-year budgeting wouldn't make that much difference. So I think it's both the official process that matters and also the way the process actually unfolds.
Danielle?
Going back to minimum wage, the report yesterday analyzed 2 different minimum wage levels that are well above $7.25 and said they both would more likely than not reduce jobs. I'm curious, in the proposals that are out there, is it possible we're missing a happy medium? Is it possible there's a minimum wage hike, based on what you know, the literature you've reviewed, that would have a roughly net zero effect on employment, but still increase people's paychecks? Like $8, $8.50, I don't know.
We have not looked at others, at other possible increases. So I don't want to speculate too much.
Sure.
But I would just say there's no particular trick in what we're in the analysis that we're doing here and what economists have found for past minimum wage increases. We estimate that if the minimum wage were raised, that the vast majority of people who would be affected by that increase would keep their jobs and receive higher wages. So by our estimates, the middle point of these two estimates, something like 97 or 99% of the people who would be affected by the increase in the minimum wage would receive higher wages, and their family incomes would be higher as a result. But at the same time, the 1%, 3%, people would not be able to find employment. So I think as you move to larger and larger increases in the minimum wage, from 0 up to going to $9 or $10.10 or beyond that, you're likely to find progressively larger numbers of people who benefit from raising wages and progressively larger reductions in employment.
Frank.
Just to clarify, assertions made by Democrats and those on the left after your report came out, and Pelosi said your report's conclusions contradict the consensus among hundreds of America's top economists. You disagree with that assertion. And second question, do you think that, that letter sent by the economists said that increases in the minimum wage have little to no negative effect on the employment or minimum wage workers? You seem to think that your report kind of lined up with that assessment by the economists. Do you think that a loss of 500,000 jobs would equal little to no negative impact on the unemployment?
So I'm not going to speak directly to what Leader Pelosi has said. I can only speak about our analysis. And as I said before, our analysis is quite consistent with the latest thinking by economists. What I noted about this letter and about the survey that I referred to is that those economists don't put numbers to their words. So it's hard to know exactly what the people meant by little to no effect. It's hard to know exactly what people meant in the survey by noticeably harder to find a job. Our estimates for $9 minimum wage, which, as I said, is the sort of increase that's most consistent with the increases that economists have studied in the past in terms of the extent of the increase and how far into the wage distribution it cuts. Our analysis of that proposal suggests that the decline in employment would be between 2.5% and a slight increase. And I think a 2.5% decline to many people would be a small decline or a little decline. And a slight increase would be consistent with there being no effect, roughly. So I don't think one can tell from that statement in this letter. One can't be sure exactly how that set of economists would take our results. And moreover, as I noted, that is not a representative sampling of economists. So I don't think you can tell anything from that particular wording that is different from what we've done, nor can you tell, nor does that wording prove those economists would agree with what we've done. What we have done ourselves is to do a very careful reading of the literature, and we have put some weight on a wide range of results. Naturally, the economists who put more weight on certain studies than others will reach different conclusions. And some economists undoubtedly will find our estimates of the employment effects to be larger than they would pick themselves, and other economists would find our estimates of the employment effects to be smaller than they would pick themselves. Our job is to provide the Congress with a balanced reading, and we've done that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
If you don't mind, Tamar Hallerman from CQ. I'm wondering if there's if you could put a percentage to what the chances that the impact on unemployment at the 10-10 range could be far lower, say 100,000.
Well, so the range that we've provided for an increase in the minimum wage to $10.10 is from a very slight decrease in employment to minus 1 million workers. And we say that we've constructed this range to capture, as best we can judge, 2/3 of the distribution of possible outcomes. So that means that there's, in our judgment, a 1/6 chance that the effects of raising the minimum wage to $10.10 would be a bigger decline in employment than 1 million, and a 1/6 chance that raising the minimum wage to $10.10 would either would not reduce employment at all or would increase employment. And a 2/3 chance that the effect would be between a slight decrease and a decrease of about 1 million workers.
Stiff arm from...
We are coming to you, Alexis.
Did this stiff arm from Democrats surprise you at all, or was this something that you expected, this reaction?
For much of the work that we do, there is a range of reactions, and we take great pains in doing analysis to read widely ahead of time and to consult with people with a wide range of views. And if you look at the people we list at the end of our document with whom we spoke about this work, you will see from knowing their own work that they came to this question with a very different sets of views of what would happen. So we understand that there'll be a range of reactions among professionals, analysts outside of CBO, and among policymakers and commentators outside of CBO. That doesn't surprise us, nor does it have any effect on the work that we do.
Alexis?
When CBO scored ACA, you scored what the legislative language said, implementation dates, et cetera. Is there anything that we should be thinking about as the executive branch eases or changes some of the deadlines that we've been seeing either for the individual market or for employers that would make us want to reconsider or reevaluate the fiscal impact of the Affordable Care Act, either short-term or long-term, especially since the administration has been so interested in saying it is already bending the cost curve in healthcare?
So as part of our regular updates of our budget projections, we update the effects of the coverage provisions, the insurance coverage provisions of the Affordable Care Act. We don't, as part of that process, update the effects of the Medicare changes or the revenue changes, because in those parts of the Affordable Care Act made changes to a large body of existing law. And it's not possible at this point to really disentangle the effects of the Affordable Care Act in Medicare with all of the pre-existing law in Medicare. We do projections of Medicare as it stands. The Affordable Care Act is not really separable from the other parts of Medicare law. The insurance coverage provisions are more separable because they're basically, we're building a new superstructure on the rest of federal law. So just the nature of our doing our baseline projections, we get estimates regularly in this process of the effects of the insurance coverage provisions. And our estimate of the effects of those provisions on the budget has not changed substantially since 2010. We've incorporated a slew of new analysis, a slew of changes from what we had expected in the way the law is being implemented. But on balance, our estimate of the budgetary effects of those provisions on a year-by-year basis is not much different at all from what we said 4 years ago. The 10-year totals that you'll hear about have changed because the 10-year budget window is now a number of years further into the future than it was 4 years ago. But on a year-to-year basis, the various changes that have been made by the administration and implementation as a result of the Supreme Court decision, as a result of developments in the healthcare system, as a result of more analysis by us and others, all those things on balance have not changed our estimate of the budgetary effects very much. We will be, as part of our spring baseline projections, once again updating the effects of the coverage provisions, and I don't know where that will come out, and you will all get to know about it at the same time together in a few months. As for the effects of the Affordable Care Act on healthcare costs, we've said before and still believe that we don't know what effect those provisions are having. There is an extensive, not extensive yet, but a growing literature of economists analyzing the slowdown in healthcare costs over the past half dozen years or so. We did a report last summer about the slowdown in Medicare spending growth. We looked at effects actually before the Affordable Care Act, so we looked at the effects of the business cycle, which we found to be not detectable, and the effects of many other sorts of changes. Over time, I think economists will study the question of how much the Affordable Care Act is mattering for healthcare costs, and then we'll know. We don't know now. There are a few specific channels, of course. The Affordable Care Act brought down payments to Medicare providers relative to what they would have been otherwise, so that reduces federal healthcare spending and national healthcare spending. But the more indirect effects the law may be having on the way medicine is practiced in the private sector is not something that we have any analysis to bring to bear at the moment.
How long do you think we'll have to wait?
Well, economists are still thrashing around a bit about issues related to the Great Depression in the 1930s. So economists can look at things for a long time and have somewhat different views. I think that the challenge for the Affordable Care Act will be that some of the channels through which it may affect healthcare spending are rather indirect. So one can tote up, in a way, the effects on Medicare's payments to providers. But the extent to which the spread of accountable care organizations or Medicare's penalties for readmission of patients from hospitals to hospitals, the extent to which those changes in law will spill over to how healthcare is delivered outside of Medicare are subtle factor, or those are subtle connections, and I think they will be hard to detect. But I expect that in a few years, certainly, you will see clever research that will be trying to get at that.
Mark Trumbull?
Hi. I just wanted to follow up on the participation rate forecast that you have, which interests me. Do you see that as happening mainly because of demographic aging, or is it also a long-term diminishing of all age groups or younger workers? And what are the implications of that? I mean, it seems to me the Fed has talked about thinking, well, 6.5% unemployment is a threshold where but they say it's likely we'll keep interest rates low for a lot longer than that, maybe because of participation coming back. So by your analysis, is the message to the Fed maybe we should just start thinking about raising rates sooner?
So I don't send messages to the Fed. So we think, if you look back over the last decade, part of the decline in the participation rate that has been the aging of the population, and part of the decline has been changes in participation rates within age groups. As we look ahead, we think there'll be some further decline in participation within some age groups, but not very much. As we look at what's been going on, we think those effects are mostly waning. So as we look ahead, most of what is going on over the next decade is the aging of the population. We have a large number of people who are moving from an age at which most people work to an age at which most people do not work. And that is visible in the federal budget, in the cost for Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and it's visible in the labor force participation rate. But I'd emphasize that we also think the participation rate has been pushed down by the cyclical weakness in the economy. If the demand for workers was stronger, so if the demand for firms' products was strong enough that they felt the need to hire more workers to meet that demand, then we think the participation rate would be a percentage point higher than it actually is today. So we think there are nearly 3 million people who are out of the labor force who will come back in if the demand for workers was stronger. And we also think there are about 3 million people who are in the labor force but unemployed who would go back to work if the economy was stronger. And those two pieces are our tally, that the economy is about 6 million jobs short of where it would be if the participation rate were back up to where it would be without the cyclical weakness, and if the unemployment rate were back down to its pre-recession level. We think there's a great deal of slack left in the economy. Now, how that should influence the Federal Reserve's policymaking is an issue for somebody else to sit here and talk to you about.
Okay. So then, are you saying that your forecast, in a way, is predicting that slack will just not be absorbed or
No, so we think the slack will diminish mostly between now and 2017. We think the economy is strengthening, not every week or every month, but we think on balance the economy is strengthening, and that will push up the demand for workers and bring down the unemployment rate, and that factor will tend to push up the labor force participation rate. You don't see that in the picture because that upward pressure is being more than offset by downward pressure from the demographics.
Kevin Hall?
The ACA is going to take 2,000 jobs, but we're going to get 2,000 from this.
Louder, Kevin.
It's easy. The question on the ACA, following up on my colleague's question, the Centrist Urban Institute and some others suggested that you perhaps didn't give enough weight to the Massachusetts experience, and I wondered how you might, how much that factored in, since one set of data is what the world that might be versus the world that was. I realize it's one state. But how did you manage that? And in a perfect world, if you could do it all over again, do you feel the ACA part of the 10-year outlook was useful or muddied the waters, given the fact that, as you just mentioned, Alexis, we won't know for a while? Is it helpful, or do you feel like it's kind of muddied the waters a bit?
Well, our responsibility is to give Congress our projections of what will happen to the budget and the economy under current law. And one aspect of current law that impinges on the labor market is the Affordable Care Act. So we have no choice but to produce analysis of how the Affordable Care Act and other features of the tax system and transfer system will affect the labor market and other parts of the economy. That's our responsibility to them. It is also our responsibility to explain our analysis as clearly as we can. And we tried to do that in the appendix to the Outlook. And when we thought there was sufficient degree of misunderstanding what we had done, we tried to explain further in this blog post, as we've done on some other occasions where we think there have been misunderstandings. As for the Massachusetts experience, that is an example of something that is somewhat like the Affordable Care Act, but is not exactly like the Affordable Care Act in a whole collection of ways. And it is just one state and not a randomly selected state out of the 50 states. So we have looked at the experience there, but we don't think that is more compelling than the evidence from many analyses of the effects of higher tax rates on labor supply, and a number of analyses of the effects of expansions and contractions in the Medicaid program on labor supply. So we put our emphasis on those broader literature based on a broader set of experiments.
Was Urban correct in suggesting that the Massachusetts experience did not lead in net job losses? You didn't see that behavior?
So I think it's hard to know what the effects of the Massachusetts health reform was on labor markets in Massachusetts. And I have not studied that enough myself to speak clearly to it. But remember, labor markets are affected by lots of different things. And so extracting the effect of any particular factor is difficult. We estimated a few years ago, and still think very, very strongly, that the American Recovery Act spurred employment and output relative to what otherwise would have happened in this country. But at the same time, lots of other factors were affecting output and employment.
You didn't think it was a tragedy to lament?
We don't use words like that.
As you know, somebody
either
did.
good ones or bad ones. But you can't just look up a time series of U.S. employment and know from that how much the Recovery Act did to the economy. Anymore, you can look up from that time series what any other individual influence did to the economy.
We've got about 10 minutes left. We're going to go to Eric Wasson and then Chris Moody before we do a second round. Eric?
Just to put a finer point on the stimulus, I mean, it's 5 years out. How would you compare projections for the stimulus, like that you and others thought, compared to what actually happened, talking jobs and deficit? And then also, maybe you've asked this elsewhere, but would you be willing to serve another term when this one's up?
On the first question, there have been a number of analyses of the effects of the Recovery Act on the economy. They've reached a set of different conclusions. We still think in that case that the more powerful evidence comes from a long history of research on the effects of changes in federal spending and taxes. And we give some weight to the research that has looked specifically at the Recovery Act, but we put more weight on research that has looked over time at all sorts of changes in federal spending and taxes. And we've written about the evidence that we've drawn on in this case in a working paper a year or so ago. So our assessment is still essentially what it was 5 years ago, which is that the Recovery Act, by raising federal spending and cutting taxes, spurred the demand for goods and services in the economy at a time when demand was the constraining factor on output and employment. And by doing that, the Recovery Act raised output and employment substantially relative to what it would have been otherwise. On your second question, I love my job, and I'm focused on doing it this year.
Okay. Chris.
The media landscape has changed, particularly with the rise of social media, and we've seen a lot of times, a lot of your papers that are highly involved with certain things that are, hot political issues get amplified on Twitter, when someone maybe writes a headline that's not particularly accurate. We saw that in the healthcare study, and that just gets amplified on Twitter, and all of a sudden the message is gone, and it's the narrative. Can you describe what it's like internally when you have a paper you've worked on for so long, thousands of words that gets reduced to a tweet that is wrong, but that becomes the narrative? What's that like inside the CBO, and when it just seems to kind of get out of hand?
Well, as I said, we try to write as clearly as we can about our analyses. And in this case of the effects of the Affordable Care Act on labor markets, we were, I think, quite clear in the appendix and the outlook about how the effects we were describing would come almost entirely from changes in workers' decisions about whether and how much to work, rather than from employers' decisions about whether to hire them. At the same time, we recognize that in this case and many, many others, the work that we do is technically complicated. And people who read it will misunderstand it sometimes. And there's a regular part of our process to look at what people have written about our work and to give them a call if we think they've misunderstood it. So a number of you talk to us about how you're interpreting our work to make sure that you're seeing all the facets of it. And we reach out to you if we read something that we think shows that that not everything was clear. And we do the same thing, of course, with the people on the Hill for whom we work. If we see things that seem to us to be misunderstandings of our work, then we try to clarify them. And basically, I'm happy that there are, it seems to me, a growing number of people who are interested in serious quantitative analysis of public policy. I think that's a great thing for folks like me and my colleagues who do serious quantitative analysis of public policy. But you're right that there's a sort of a faster feedback loop in the comments than there's been before. And I think that increases the importance for us of being very clear about our results when we release them.
Is there someone in the CBO that watches Twitter and just sees this narrative shaping up?
So Deborah Kilrow, who's here, and many of you know, is watching what's happening. And but you know, we're not a very large place, and we have probably any given area that you could name, we probably have fewer people doing that than you might expect. And so we rely on a few very good people to try to cover a lot of territory, and that's true in our communications strategy, and it's also true in how we run our IT, and it's true in all the areas of policy that we analyze for the Congress. We're trying to get the very most out of the funding that we receive. And our job is mostly to speak to the Congress. We think it's important that the other reporting of our work be accurate, because we recognize that many members and staffers in the Congress won't go to our website necessarily. They'll learn about our work through something else they read. So we think it's very important to have that be right. But our job is basically to do the analysis and give it to Congress. It's not basically to sort of be the hall monitor in the Twitterverse about our work.
I think we got the quote for the morning. Paul Krausek, you've got a...
If that's it, that's okay.
And then I'm sorry, then I'll come to you, sir, because you haven't had one. Paul?
Are you taking a more in-depth look at the effect of laws and proposals on the labor market than you did in the past? And if so, is that because you have more sophisticated models to do it now?
Well, one of the areas that we have focused on in the last 5 years at CBO is to strengthen our modeling of the effects of fiscal policy on the economy. I think that is an absolutely crucial issue for Congress, because a lot of the proposals to deal with the growing budget deficits and debt have involved significant changes in policy that would affect the economy in potentially important ways. And we think that as we look at changes in immigration policy that are being considered, changes in tax policy that might be considered, we think we need to be able to give Congress estimates, analysis that is at the cutting edge of what the economics profession can do. So we have spent time building up our modeling in that area, and we put it to use. But we've worked in other areas as well. Obviously, we've strengthened our modeling of the health insurance system. For people under age 65, we've strengthened our modeling of the health insurance system for people over age 65 in our work on premium support proposals. So part of what we need to do at CBO all the time is to do the analytic work to be ready for the policy proposals when they come. And I think we mostly hit that target, and I'm glad when we do, and when we don't, then we regret it, and we try to scramble to catch up.
Jonathan, you haven't had him. Go for it.
Thank you. My apologies for being late today. Two real quick things, one technical, one an overview. The technical thing, relatively easy. The President's budget is supposed to be submitted March 4. How long do you expect you'll take to get something back to Congress date, given its lateness? And then the big overall question is you put out a little bit of, I thought, kind of under-noticed stuff back in November, December, saying that to stabilize the debt, you need about $2 trillion over the long term. You need about $2 trillion in 10-year savings. To reduce it to pre-recession levels, about $4 trillion over 10 years. That seems very similar, oddly, to what Bull Simpson was saying back in 2010. I'm curious as to, you walk us through the overview of how much progress was made on deficit reduction in these 4 years from 2010 to what seems to be now a lull in the budgetary wars.
On your first question, it traditionally takes us about a month to produce our estimates of the president's budget. But that time frame varies depending on what the policy proposals are, how familiar or unfamiliar they are to us. And it also can vary depending on the release of underlying data. So we use a lot of data that comes out with the president's budget, separate from his proposals, but data that are very important in updating our baseline work. So we won't make any precise predictions, but in the past it's been about a month. I can't speak directly to what Bull Simpson and their colleagues were saying a few years ago. Certainly, there have been changes in federal policy since over the last few years that have narrowed deficits as we project them. For example, in particular, the caps on discretionary funding. There have also been changes in policy that have either narrowed or widened deficits depending on one's starting point. So the extension of most of the expiring 2001-2003 tax cuts worsened the deficit relative to the current law baseline that we had been using. But allowing some of those cuts to expire narrowed the deficit relative to what other people had referred to as a current policy baseline. It was very hard to keep track, and we've not tried to keep track formally of all the changes in policy over the last few years. I think the most important thing for Congress to understand is at this point in time, what are the choices and constraints that it faces going forward? And as you said, we reported in a little report called Choices for Deficit Reduction and Update that if Congress wanted 25 years from now to have the debt to GDP ratio about where it is now, then it would need to reduce deficits over the next decade by about $2 trillion and then continue the deficit reduction in the 10th year at about the same share of GDP beyond that. And if it wanted to bring the debt back down to about the same share of GDP it was on average over the past 40 years, then it would need to do about $4 trillion of deficit reduction. That's our best estimate of where things stand now. And I think that's the most important thing to understand.
What's your guesstimate of where those numbers have moved since 2010? Were they bigger in 2010 or smaller in 2010, do you think?
Again, I think it depends crucially on what your benchmark is to start with in terms of the tax provision, the expiring tax provisions. I don't think I think if one started from a view of assuming those tax cuts would be extended, then certainly the efforts to reduce deficits since then have narrowed the future fiscal gap. On the other hand, if one started where we had to start then, which was with current law, then the extension of most of those expiring tax provisions has widened the fiscal gap.
And with that, I want to thank Director Elmendorf for doing this. Thank Deborah for the help setting it up. Hope you'll come back, sir. Thanks.
I would love to. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. No problem. So what would you have to do if you didn't want the grim scenario